Let me invite my colleague Neil Simon, the IAA's government relations guru, to join me in a brief legislative and regulatory update. Neil, let's talk about current events on Capitol Hill and what we might expect from Congress and the administration in the new year. Let's start with what's happening in the lame duck session now underway.
Well, thank you, Gail, and hello, everyone. Right now, the House is scheduled to adjourn, and that would be the final day of this session of Congress in the House on December 10th, and the Senate is set to terminate the session on December 18th. There is one essential must-pass piece of legislation, and that would provide for government funding. The current continuing resolution under which the government is funded expires on December 11th. So this is absolutely must pass. And it appears that there will not be difficulty. In other words, I'm not expecting any sort of shutdown. However, the wild card, of course, is a new COVID-19 related stimulus package. And after months and months of partisan gridlock, there is right now a flurry of activity. Really too soon to say whether it's going to result in enactment of a piece of legislation, but there is consideration of a couple slimmed down COVID-19 relief packages, less than $1 trillion, but in the House and the Senate. I think there is a good chance that Senate President McConnell will try to jam Speaker Pelosi by attaching a stripped down GOP bill to the must-pass government spending package I just talked about. That would then force Pelosi either to try to strip it out or to vote it down with a shutdown looming. I think, again, I'm not expecting a shutdown. I think the chances of it are remote. And I also think it is a less than likely that Congress and the administration will get it together to pass a pandemic package, but there certainly is a chance. Yes, Gail.
Yeah, Neil, if we actually make it to 2021, what do you expect that we'll see in the new year?
Well, Georgia is on my mind because the outcome of those two races will determine which party controls the Senate. I would add, however, that whatever the outcome, enactment of Biden's very ambitious legislative agenda will be very challenging because the majority in both the Senate and perhaps the House is going to be so narrow. In fact, a very small number of centrists from each party will be more powerful in a very narrowly controlled Senate. And in the House, the Democratic majority has also narrowed. It's going to be either 5 or 7 vote margin as 12 incumbent Democrats lost re-election, and there are still 2 seats to be decided. This makes it unlikely that Biden will be able to gain enactment of major legislation without at least some bipartisan support. And as you know, bipartisan is a endangered species inside the Beltway right now. However, one piece of legislation that I do expect that could be enacted is a piece of retirement savings legislation. The chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, which is the tax writing committee, Richie Neal from Massachusetts, and the ranking minority member, the ranking Republican, Kevin Brady from Texas, did introduce a piece of legislation just last month. Not that they expected it was going to move in this Congress, but just to as a marker for the next Congress. And among other things, it would increase the required minimum, the RMD, to age 75. There's a baby boomer catch-up provision and a whole bunch of other things. So certainly stay tuned for that. I should also add that you may all have read about the so-called Congressional Review Act, CRA, under which Congress can, within the first 60 days of a new session, nullify major rulemakings that became final in the 60 legislative days of the previous session, in other words, of the current session. It was used by this Congress early in the Trump administration to nullify 16 or 17 rules. I think it could be used, especially if the Dems, really only if the Dems get the Senate. And I think some environmental regulations will be at the top of the list. Whether it reaches down to some of the issues that we care so deeply about, perhaps DOL, ESG, or Department of Labor proxy, time will tell. Stay tuned.
Great. So it sounds, Neil, like most of the action is going to be at the executive level. And so, that's not a big surprise. What are you hearing about Biden's probable appointments?
Well, I don't know a whole lot more than the rest of you, as I'm sure we're all reading the papers and looking into our crystal balls. Certainly, I'm not expecting any difficulty whatsoever for Janet Yellen at Treasury. However, Neera Tamlin at the Office of Management and Budget, a very powerful executive agency, seems to be in trouble with Senate Republicans. Also, Brian Deese, who was an assistant secretary of Treasury in the Obama administration and more recently is global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, who Biden reportedly wants to head the National Economic Council, seems to be in trouble with progressives in his own party. Gail, I know that Jay Clayton has announced his resignation. But what are you expecting over at the SEC and CFTC? Are agency heads required to step down?
So that's an interesting question. I think first for the SEC, once Clayton leaves, there is likely to be an acting chair put in place pretty quickly, since an acting chair does not need Senate confirmation. And my best guess would be Commissioner Allison Lee. She's the senior Democrat sitting on the commission right now. So in some ways, I think the SEC may have a pretty smooth transition, at least in the near term. Now, the CFTC and Department of Labor heads have not yet announced plans to leave, at least as of the last time I checked. And here's where it gets interesting. Heads of core executive agencies like the Treasury work at the pleasure of the president. So as a practical matter, that means that Secretary Scalia will definitely be leaving the Department of Labor. But the CFTC, like the SEC, is an independent agency, and the analysis has become less clear. Before this summer, it seemed settled that the president could not fire the head of an independent agency except for cause. But a Supreme Court case held that the president can actually fire the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And that calls into question whether the president can fire at will the head of a commission, the head of an agency that has a commission. So in the very unlikely event that Tarbit were to decide to stay or to try to stay, we would definitely see some interesting legal drama, which is really only interesting for lawyers unless it becomes Washington drama. So I think that's my prognostication on the agency heads.
Well, let's stay with on the regulatory side now. Of course, every time an administration changes, and we're seeing quite a profound change in approach to government right now, there's a flurry of activity coming out of the White House and regulatory change. What can we expect to see out of the Biden White House in the near term in terms of regulatory change of relevance to advisors?
Yeah, well, what we've realized in the few past administrations is that executive orders actually have a lot of power. And new administrations that come in will typically rescind or modify executive orders from earlier administrations that they find objectionable. And I think there's plenty that the Biden administration will decide is objectionable. They also put in place some of their own, proactive agenda items through executive order. So I expect that we will see rescission of current orders that touch on the environment, on healthcare, and on immigration. For example, we will probably see a quick reversal of the Trump administration's position on the Dreamers Act, DACA. We are also likely to see proactive orders on climate change. And we could even see orders on diversity and inclusion, along the lines perhaps of requiring agencies to conduct D&I training or to collect and report additional data to be more transparent about D&I statistics. Independent agencies generally are not formally subject to executive orders, but they also usually agree to follow the spirit of the orders. So that's what we would expect to see here as well. And so these, any orders that have been rescinded or new orders would effectively cover the SEC and the CFTC as well. I would note that even if you get rid of an executive order, it's not that easy to reverse policy if actions have been taken under that executive order, like rulemakings. So anything that's formalized, like through a rulemaking, would need to go through the notice and comment process to be changed. And that, as we know, is a long and slow process. Now, the president can also freeze regulations that haven't yet gone into effect, pending a review by the new administration. And this is probably why the Department of Labor has been pushing so hard to get its rules finalized and effective before Biden takes office. Now, of course, the new administration can also simply decline to enforce rules that have already gone into effect by focusing on different priorities. So there are some options that an administration has.
Yeah, and I'd add, I'm also expecting to see some legislative activity on DEI in Congress. So we could see things happening out of the executive branch as well as Congress in that area. Gail, of course, there's an existing RegFlex agenda. What is on the RegFlex agenda currently that you expect that there will be continuing activity on in the new year?
Sure. Well, before I talk about the RegFlex agenda, I think it's very important that the first thing we will likely see at all the agencies is a shift in enforcement priorities. So with respect to rules that the new administration and leadership don't like, as I said, it's really much harder to overturn them than one would think, but they do have a lot of discretion around enforcing. So, for example, the SEC may not try to change Reg BI through a rulemaking. We could just see dramatic increase in enforcement efforts around Reg BI. As for the RegFlex, an item that we have been very pleased to see on the agenda has been modernizing the outdating custody rule. And we understand that efforts on that are well underway at the staff level. We expect them to continue. We also think, and this is not an item on the RegFlex agenda, but we think it has momentum, which is e-delivery. That we think that there's a real appetite to change the default from paper delivery to electronic delivery. And we think that momentum will likely to continue, largely because of lessons learned from the pandemic. We might also see efforts to redo the recent proxy and shareholder submission rules because of their potential to have a negative effect on the right to vote shares and on corporate governance sort of more generally. But it is almost harder to undo a rule, as I said, and these two have been very controversial, and I think it'll be a challenge to try to undo them. We are almost certain to see a flurry of ESG related activity on the regulatory front, probably focusing on issuer and advisor disclosure. I think we're going to see renewed efforts to do a joint rulemaking on executive compensation. This is actually required under the Dodd-Frank Act, and it has pretty much been frozen for 10 years. And the last one I'd mention, and I've gone a little astray from what's actually on the RegFlex agenda, this is really just more what I expect maybe on the next one, is that a Democratic administration is very likely to revive efforts on the Financial Stability Oversight Council, the FSOC, to focus on systemic risk. And I think we should expect to see FSOC taking another look at money market funds and other short-term funding vehicles. And it may also look again at designating individual non-banks, including large asset managers, as systemically important. This is something we've opposed in the past, and so we'll be keeping an eye on these developments here as well. And now, Neil, I think it looks like we are out of time, and so let's wrap up our legislative and regulatory update. Thank you for your insights.